Hi everyone. My name's Imraan Valodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality at Wits. I'd like to welcome you all today to the to uh, uh, to, to 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 the fourth of our Pro Vice Chancellor kind of seminars uh, 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 for for this year. So, as part of its university's uh, 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 kind of intentions to promote research and thinking on climate change, we run this kind of high level uh, uh, kind of pro vice chancellor seminar on kind of issues of climate change, and this is the fourth and the last one for this year. Please look out for our seminars for next year. So uh, 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 I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today. Professor Debra Roberts has been kind of a scientist who's uh, been working for more than four decades on the science and the policy sides of climate change, both in South Africa and also internationally. I think as you as you would have seen from the note that we shared kind of about the seminar, she is considered kind of to be among the top 100 names across the world on kind of issues of climate change. She worked for a long time from 1994 uh, uh, kind of until last year as the head of the Sustainable and Resilient City Initiatives Unit and the environmental planning and climate protection department in the kind of city of Durban. Besides her work in uh, 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 kind of in the city of Durban, she's one of the authors of kind of a number of IPCC reports. She also holds a number of academic positions kind of at South African universities and kind of also at universities across the world. I think we're really pleased today to have one one of one of the world's leading kind of scientists on on climate change addressing us. So without any uh, 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 kind of further words from me, let me pass it on to Professor Roberts, who kind of present her lecture, and then we'll have some time for Q&A from there. So kind of over to you, Deborah.
Super. Thanks, Imran, and thanks for making this opportunity available. Let me just share my screen so that we can move ahead. I'm trusting that everyone can now see that, and I'll put it into presentation mode.
It's appeared now. We can all see it.
We just, yeah, voila. There we have it.
All
excellent.
Good. Over to you.
Super. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for making the time to engage in this conversation. Ostensibly about climate change, but I do want to expand the remit of that conversation to talk about an emergent challenge which isn't yet receiving the kind of global attention it needs to, and that's the issue of temperature goal overshoot. And as Imran indicated, I've done a variety of things in my career, worn a variety of hats, so I am bringing a number of perspectives to our conversation today. I've certainly trained as a scientist, and as Imran indicated, I'm associated with two tertiary institutions, the University of KwaZulu-Natal here in South Africa, but also the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I've played a role in the global scientific assessment process in the last assessment cycle of the IPCC. I was co-chair of Working Group 2, and I'm currently a coordinating lead author on the special report on climate change in cities for the IPCC. I've also been a climate change negotiator for South Africa in the fields of loss and damage and adaptation, and currently one of the experts that's worked on the indicators for the global goal and adaptation. But really more important than any of these is the fact that I've spent 30 years working as a local government practitioner in the city of Durban. And that's really where my emphasis on radical realism comes in. I think it's great to talk about science and the theory linked to that, but we've got to be pragmatic and work in the real world. And I think this new emerging challenge is something that poses a real hurdle for those in the policy and practitioner space. So important for us to see what the science says about it. But I am aware that probably not everyone on the call is as deeply invested in climate change science and policy as I might be. So let's try and establish a baseline of understanding. I think it's safe to say that as a global society broadly, we've recognized that our activities are creating greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases are driving human-induced climate change. Those have negative impacts for us, and so we've agreed we need to do something about it. And effectively, we've come together in a global compact to try and deal with that challenge. And it's taken the form of one of the three big Rio conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. Unfortunately, this is a field really littered with acronyms. And really at the heart of that convention is quite a selfish goal in a sense. It's the desire to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. So essentially, we want to prevent the climate system being so disrupted that it poses a danger to us. And we're using a variety of tools and mechanisms to deal with that particular challenge. And key at the moment is the Paris Agreement, which rather unsurprisingly was negotiated in Paris in 2015. And at the heart of that lies a specific temperature goal, which will really be the focus of my conversation with you today. And that's contained in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. It says, as a global society, what we commit to is keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the temperatures we experienced in the pre-industrial period. And we use 1850 to 1900 as a proxy for that, because that's when we have decent measurements. But also in Article 2 is much more of an aspirational element, and that's about pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial. And that motivation really came from the lobbying of the small island states, from African countries, from the least developed countries who are really so vulnerable to climate change that they perceived that they would not be able to survive the impacts at 2 degrees. Article 4 of the Paris Agreement talks to us about how we realize these temperature aspirations, and that's about globally peaking those greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and thereafter taking rapid reductions. So that's the playing field from a policy space. Now, things like the Paris Agreement and the other tools we use under the convention are all informed by evidence, and a lot of that scientific evidence comes from, here comes another acronym, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And essentially, the IPCC was set up in 1988, really with 3 goals in mind. The first of these is to give policymakers and practitioners an objective source of information about the causes of climate change. Secondly, to talk about the impacts. And then thirdly, and probably most importantly at the moment, to talk about the responses. The way the IPCC works is in assessment cycles. So they're generally 5 to 7 years long. There have been 6 completed to date. The most recent completed cycle was the 6th assessment cycle, or AR6. We completed that in 2023. It was the longest and busiest of the assessment cycles. During the course of that assessment cycle, we produced 3 special reports, and I still marvel that we were capable of doing that. probably the best known of which is our special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was an invitation from the UNFCCC to consider this idea of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but we also produced one on land and one on the ocean and cryosphere. And then we produced the main assessment report, and that really comes in 3 installments, the first of which looks at the changes in the physical climate. The second and third really address the so what questions. So what do those changes in the physical climate mean for us in terms of impacts and adaptation needs? And what do those changes mean in terms of our mitigation ambitions? Now, if you look at all of these reports and you put them in a pile, it's about 0.5 meter of climate change science. It's over 10,000 pages of climate change assessment. I know no one in the real world who can read 10,000 pages of global scientific assessment. And unfortunately, it's the poor co-chairs of the IPCC, I think, are the only people in the world who end up reading all of these things. So we're very grateful in each assessment cycle that the IPCC produces a synthesis report, which really pulls together the key messages that are policy relevant. So it saves us reading these 10,000 pages. And I'm going to start off by diving into the key findings that are represented in that synthesis report. If you want to read it, it's freely available on the IPCC website. And if you do take the time, I think the one thing that will strike you is you can see that this very conservative consensus science really isn't pulling any punches anymore. We make it very clear in that synthesis report that our current trends of emission and development are simply incompatible with a sustainable and equitable world. And it's really not surprising. We've had over a century of fossil fuel use. We are similarly renowned as a species for our unsustainable energy use, our unsustainable land use. The net result is we've created not only a dangerous world, but a very unequal world. We live in a world where the 10% highest emitting households are responsible for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, while 50% of households with the lowest emissions are responsible for less than 15%. We also live on a very rapidly changing planet. So global average surface temperature has increased faster since 1970. And I know that I'm not the only person on the call who can remember as far back as 1970 than in any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years. So in 2018, when we delivered the special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming, we said to the world, look, the warming is at 1.1 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. 2023, we put out the synthesis report. We're up to 1.15. And just this year, some of the Working Group 1 authors have updated the indicators we used in AR6, and they indicate that we're now at 1.22. But remember, this is an average over a 10-year period. So that temperature of 1.22 degrees Celsius is actually referring to a temperature in about 2019. And I'll speak a little bit later on about more recent attempts to assess what the temperature is currently. What we also see is this rate of temperature change is simply unprecedented in the instrumental record. We're seeing an increase of just under 0.3 degrees per decade. And so no surprise when we realize that this human-induced climate change is now resulting in widespread and rapid changes in all aspects of the planetary system: the atmosphere, the ocean, the frozen parts of the world, or the cryosphere, and the biosphere, the living parts of the world. And quite frankly, you don't need to be a scientist to realize that those sorts of changes are going to have consequences for our society and for our economy. And literally these days, you've just got to open any media outlet to see the consequences. So no big surprise that we concluded in the 6th assessment cycle that human-induced climate change is creating dangerous impacts for natural systems and people literally in every region around the world. No one is immune. What we're seeing is an increase in the frequency, the intensity, and duration of heat waves, both on land, but also in the ocean, resulting in heat-related mortality. And the most obvious example of that is the current impact on the corals around the world. And I'll come back to that a little later. We're seeing the same consequences in terms of heavy rainfall. So I live in Durban. We had those massive floods in 2022, twice as likely because of climate change. We had 40% more rain over 2 days as a result of that. Same impact on droughts. We're seeing the proportion of tropical cyclones increasing. We're seeing reduced water security around the world. About half of the people living currently experience water scarcity at some point during the course of every year. Millions of people are being affected by acute food insecurity, unfortunately, in places like Africa, Asia, South and Central America, the small island states, these developed countries, and the Arctic. We're seeing the growth in agricultural productivity slowing. So here in Africa, the growth of agricultural productivity is down 34% since 1961. Because the oceans are getting warmer, they're getting more acidic. We're seeing reduction in fish and shellfish yields. We're seeing intensified impacts in the world's cities, not only because of floods, but also extreme heat events. We're seeing loss of infrastructure and livelihoods around the world. And those sectors that are actually exposed to the climate, so agriculture, forestries, fisheries, tourism, and so on, are all experiencing economic impacts. But the IPCC doesn't only look at the impacts of human-induced climate change, it also uses the scientific literature to assess our responses to climate change. And the news here is equally not uplifting. What we showed is the pace and scale of what we've been doing or what we plan to do is simply insufficient to tackle the climate change challenge. And there are two big arenas that we use to tackle human-induced climate change. The first of these is adaptation. So that's about adjusting to the changes in climate we've already experienced, but also anticipation of the changes still to come. And what we showed is that, yes, of course, adaptation has progressed across all sectors or regions, but unfortunately, it remains very fragmented, very incremental, and very sector specific. And so there's a really large adaptation gap between what we should be doing and what we are doing to adapt to climate change. Where we did find effective adaptation was often in the agricultural sector, so things like on-farm water management, soil moisture conservation, but we also saw an uptake in ecosystem-based adaptation, for example, through urban greening. But importantly, we raised a number of red flags in our assessment. The first of these is, sorry, folks, you can't adapt your way out of this problem anymore. That option no longer is on the table because there are real limits to adaptation. And these can be hard limits. So, for example, physiological limits. There simply are no options to avoid intolerable risk. And in that category, we already have a whole host of ecosystems that are at risk: the warm water corals, the coastal wetlands, the rainforests, the polar and mountain ecosystems. There are also what we call soft limits to adaptation. So there actually are options to deal with intolerable risks, but they can't be utilized for a number of reasons. And here we call out the small-scale farmers and households in coastal regions who are hitting these soft limits because of lack of policy support and financing. And of course, financing always a sore point in the climate change space, particularly adaptation, because only a small portion of globally tracked finance goes to adaptation. A second major red flag we raise is around bad adaptation. Unfortunately, what is good adaptation today is not going to be necessarily good adaptation 5 or 10 years from now. And so there are unintended consequences we need to be mindful of. So, for example, putting expensive irrigation systems into a place that's going to continually experience more intense and frequent droughts. Another major red flag we raise is around the fact that even if by some miracle we had all the money, technology, and political will we needed backing the adaptation agenda, it would not prevent all losses and damages. We're now committed to a certain portion of losses and damages. The second major front on which we deal with climate change is mitigation. It's about reducing the amount of those greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and increasing the sinks that absorb them. And the news there was, yes, again, there's been progress. We've seen policies and laws expanding, but unfortunately, government pledges on greenhouse gas emissions are making it harder to fulfill that central goal of the Paris Agreement, that temperature goal, to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's substantial gaps between what governments promise and what governments are actually doing. Now, you can see a reference to 2020 to 2021 on the slide, and that's because there are hard literature cutoff dates in each IPCC assessment, but we can see more recent work really confirming this under delivery. So, for example, just before the end of the climate negotiations, or the beginning of the climate negotiations last year, the Secretariat of the Convention produced a synthesis report, which looked at the effectiveness of current climate plans under the Paris Agreement, rather unimaginatively entitled Nationally Determined Contributions, in terms of reducing emissions. And what they showed is if all of those climate plans that were available at the time were fully implemented, and that is a really unlikely scenario because many of those climate plans are conditional on availability of finance, technology, and capacity building. But even if by some miracle all of that was available, we would only see a reduction of just under 3% relative to 2019 levels by 2030, whereas the science of the IPCC shows us that, in fact, we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. So you can see how big the gap is. But as I said, there has been progress. We've particularly seen expanding policies all the way down to subnational level. Cities are particularly active. We've seen an increase in technically viable and cost-effective options out there. We've seen this huge global uptake around solar and wind energy. The International Energy Agency, in its last couple of annual reports, spoke to us about the unstoppable shift to renewable energy, about the fact that clean energy is entering the energy system at an unprecedented rate. We've seen improvements in energy efficiency, demand-side management, more green infrastructure in our cities. But even with all of that momentum, we're still a long way from a trajectory which is actually aligned with the goals in the Paris Agreement. And unfortunately for us in the Global South, we're seeing lags in adoption of low-emission technologies in developing countries because of the usual problems, lack of finance and problems with technology development and transfer. And even though the bulk of climate finance is going towards mitigation, current financial flows fall far short of what we need. We calculated we need 3 to 6 times the available climate finance at the time. And even with the agreement around the new common quantified goal that came out of the climate negotiations last year, which would see about 300 billion coming out of the public purse of the global north by 2035, and then mobilizing a broader variety of stakeholders to try and generate 1.3 trillion, it's viewed as being largely inadequate given the adaptation and mitigation needs we currently have, basically too little, too late. So in essence, we find ourselves really ill-prepared for the hazards and extraordinary threats we face today, but also into the future. One of the things that was useful about the 6 assessment cycle is that science is advanced enough that we can now use it as a bit of a crystal ball to look at the future and determine what it might look like depending on the choices we make today. The first thing we can say about the future is because we haven't been ambitious up until this point in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the increase in average global surface temperature is more likely than not to reach that 1.5, which is such a critical part of the Paris Agreement and policy mobilization in the first half of the 2030s. So that's what we said in the 6 assessment cycle. Remember that first half of the 2030s, because I'll come back to that timeline a little later. What I want to do here is a bit of a detour, because what most worries me as someone who's worked across the science policy divide is most of my practitioner and policy colleagues regard 1.5, if we are capable of limiting global warming to that, and I will not have reassuring news on that either, but even if we were able to get off the carbon superhighway at 1.5, they think that creates a safe and sustainable world, and nothing could be further from the truth. Even at global warming levels, which are currently below 1.5, we're seeing continental scale wildfires, multi-seasonal droughts, devastating floods, and extreme heat events in our cities. So even now, the world is an extremely dangerous pace. And if you read our special report on 1.5 degrees of warming, we didn't sugarcoat it. We indicated very clearly, and this is clearly what policymakers and practitioners didn't read, is that warming of 1.5 is not considered safe for most nation communities, ecosystems, and sectors, and it poses significant risks. And I think that's what we've got to remember, is 1.5 is not safe. The question is, why did we accept it then when we were negotiating in Paris? And having been a negotiator at the time, this recent report from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, people who are not prone to overstatement, I think really hits the nail on the head. At the time we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, we really lacked the information on the level of risk that was actually on the table with 1.5 and 2. And so ultimately, in agreeing to the Paris Agreement, we implicitly accepted much higher levels of risk than we actually understood at the time. And I think that's an important realization. And the reason for this is that what we showed in AR6 is that the risks, impacts, and related losses and damages increase with every increment of warming. Every tiny bit of warming increases the risk, impact, and losses and damages that we're going to have to deal with. We also showed in our 6 assessments that the high risks are now assessed to occur at lower global warming levels than we previously thought. So that increases the challenge we face. So if we are looking at a future where we continue to produce emissions from fossil fuels, that mean further warming, we will continue to impact every aspect of the planetary system. It means absolutely every region will face an increase in climate hazards, be that an increase in tropical cyclone intensity, more melting of ice and snow, which means more sea level rise, flooding, biodiversity loss, reduced food production, a whole host of human health impacts from mental health to heat-related deaths. We'll see changes in extremes becoming more noticeable, and quite frankly, you've just got to wake up every day to see that. And we'll have to deal with compound and cascading risks, which are much more difficult for us to manage. So if we look out at the future and imagine a warming world, what we were able to say is that as the world warms, we will face an increase in climate hazards in the near future, and the adverse impacts will increase. So think about a warming world out to 4 degrees. We know we'll experience more extreme heat events. The annual hottest day temperatures will increase, particularly if you live in the mid-latitude, semi-arid regions and the South American monsoon region. We know that soil moisture will be impacted, and that will have consequences not only for agriculture, but it will have consequences for biodiversity. In terms of biodiversity, we're expecting species losses. So if we think about a world warmed to 3 degrees, the risk of biodiversity loss and species extinction is 10 times greater in a world at 3 degrees than it is at 1.5 degrees of global warming. Of course, there is to human health from heat and humidity, and you've just got to look at these maps to see that above 2 degrees, you've really got to start questioning the habitability of the tropics. And of course, impacts for food production, staple crops like maize, impacts on fisheries because of the fact that the ocean is warming and becoming more acidic. So what we say in the 6 assessment cycle, unfortunately, is that losses and damages are now a part of our future. And unfortunately, they disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable ecosystems. And the reason for this is that we're reaching limits. Our ability to adjust to the changes becomes more constrained and less effective the hotter it gets. And we know that there'll be real adaptation limits in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation, because the ecosystems themselves will be impacted by the higher temperatures and therefore not able to deliver the ecosystem services that we rely on. We know there'll also be adaptation limits in terms of water management. So above 1.5 degrees Celsius, insufficient fresh water for people to continue living on some islands and mountains is a possibility. There's also the possibility at 1.5 of irreversible changes, species extinctions, and loss of biodiversity in ecosystems, particularly those at-risk ecosystems. Above 1.5, we're expecting dangerous feedback in the climate system. So, for example, the thawing of the permafrost, which will release carbon into the atmosphere and make it much more difficult for us to return to 1.5. And if you look at the NOAA scorecard for the Arctic tundra from last year, they identify that the Arctic tundra has already moved from being a sink of carbon into being a source of carbon because of 2 things: wildfires and the fact that the permafrost is beginning to thaw. We already know today that we are committed to unavoidable sea level rise over centuries and millennia. And we're expecting severe infrastructure damage in low-lying coastal settlements. So think about the middle of the century, you're going to have about 1 billion people living on small islands and low-lying cities by the sea who will be subject to the negative impacts of sea level rise. So we can see that climate change really is an existential threat to our well-being, to our livelihoods, to the global economy, and importantly to the ecosystems we rely on for our survival and our ability to thrive. But one big red flag we raised during the 6 assessment cycle that hadn't received adequate attention in previous assessments was this equity and climate justice piece, because it's the vulnerable people who've contributed the least to this problem who are going to be disproportionately and adversely affected. We showed that almost half of the world's population currently lives in regions that are highly vulnerable to climate change, so 3.3 to 3.6 billion people. And during the decade 2010 to 2020, deaths from floods, droughts, and storms were 15 times higher in highly vulnerable regions, read the Global South, compared to the more resilient regions, read the Global North. And exposure to climate hazards is increasing due to massive urbanization. This is the most rapid period of urbanization in our species history, and migration, but also growing inequality. You know, one of the most frightening reports I've read recently was a report put out last year by the World Bank entitled The Great Reversal, which showed that 50% of the 75 poorest countries in the world are now effectively getting poorer. We're seeing a historical reversal of development in these poorest nations, while individuals like Elon Musk stand to become the world's first trillionaires. So a deeply unequal world. And so there's this real need for climate justice, particularly for those who rely on the land and sea to make their living, small-scale fishers, small-scale farmers. And without strong climate action, we know that losses and damages will disproportionately fall on the most vulnerable communities around the world. And of course, it's on our continent, Africa and Asia, the least developed countries, South and Central America, the small islands and the Arctic. So it was unsurprising, I suppose, in 2018 when we released the special report on global warming of 1.5 that we really called out to the world the unprecedented scale of the challenge that we faced as a global society in realizing those core objectives, not only of the Paris Agreement, but the convention. And unfortunately, the challenge has become greater. So what, in fact, should we be doing? Well, it's really important in this decade that we accelerate our adaptation action. We've got to try and close the adaptation gap. The question is, are we doing that? If we look at the most recent adaptation gap report from UNEP, they should be releasing the newest one shortly. I haven't checked. But if we look at the one from last year, it shows that our adaptation action continues to fall well below needs, that implementation is slow, that adaptation comes with a much bigger price tag than we thought. Just for the global south in this decade, we need between about 200 to 400 billion per year to deal with adaptation needs. And I hear from people working on the new adaptation gap report that these costs are likely to be increased in their new assessment. We have seen a small uptick in adaptation funding from about 22 billion in 2021 to 28 billion in 2022. Which marks some progress to what we agreed at the climate negotiations in Glasgow in 2021, which was about doubling adaptation finance to 38 billion by 2025. Again, from people in the know, suggests that we're not going to meet that target, but even if we did, it would only reduce the adaptation finance gap by about 5%. On the mitigation side, if we become serious about limiting global warming to 1.5 or well below 2, that would mean rapid, deep, and immediate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I do mean rapid and immediate, because in all of the pathways we modeled during the course of AR6 that were compatible with 1.5 degrees with little or no overshoot, we need to see a peaking of greenhouse gas emissions sometime between 2020 but definitely before 2025. And again, we ask ourselves the question, have we seen that? No. I mean, if you look at the World Meteorological Organization latest greenhouse gas bulletin, they've confirmed the original assumptions made earlier this year that in fact we reached an all-time record high in terms of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere in 2024, coming in at about 424 parts per million. And in fact, the increase in atmospheric concentrations between 2023 and 2024 was the largest we've seen since modern measurements began in 1957. Why? Obviously consistently driven by our use of fossil fuels, but enhanced fire emissions from the increased wildfires. But also importantly, and this is a new element within the climate change arena, is a potential reduction in the amount of greenhouse gases being absorbed by our terrestrial and ocean ecosystems, which could signal a change in the climate feedback, that we're reaching new tipping points. And in fact, this year we saw a paper come out which suggests for the terrestrial ecosystems that their ability to absorb carbon dioxide is now declining. In fact, they reached a peak way back in 2008, which means carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere will now rise more rapidly, which means we need to become more ambitious in reducing our emissions. And in fact, this was followed up by a very recent paper looking at Australian tropical rainforest trees. And they've shown that those trees, both in terms of the trunks and the branches, have now become carbon sources rather than carbon sinks. So we begin to see a change in the ability of our natural ecosystems absorb carbon dioxide. And this is important because currently the land and the ocean absorb 50% of the carbon dioxide we produce as a society. This shouldn't come as a surprise because if we look at what is still powering the world, despite this massive uptake of renewable energy, the bulk of our energy needs are still met by fossil fuels, gas, coal, and oil. And even if we look at the year-on-year increase in our energy needs, you would have seen, if you follow the media, this huge splash in the media about the fact that the largest share of growth in global energy supply has been met by renewables this year. So that year-on-year increase, 38% of that was met this year by renewables. But what those headlines didn't tell you is that 54% of that year-on-year increase is still being met by fossil fuels. So the percentage of renewables is increasing, but by far the bulk is still being met by coal, oil, and natural gas, with nuclear bringing up the rear at 8%. And so no surprise, when the emissions gap report from UNEP last year observed that unless the new climate plans, which governments have been delivering this year, so they're renewing their NDCs, unless those are dramatically more ambitious, and there's no sign that they are, this Paris Agreement 1.5 goal will simply be gone within a few years. And in fact, that report says that we're probably on track for warming of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees. Majority of physical scientists I speak to think we're going to come in at about 2.7, and I'm told that that will be the kind of key message of this year's emission gap report. So if we think about the likelihood of exceeding these core elements of the Convention and the Paris Agreement, preventing dangerous interference with the climate system, achieving these temperature goals of well below 2 and pursuing 1.5, you can wave goodbye to 1.5 in your rearview mirror. 2 degrees is following that very shortly, which worries me more because that really stresses our adaptation limits, and 3 is potentially on the horizon. And again, no surprise if you look at why, if you look at the production gap report that came out this year, it shows that governments in aggregate still promise or still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than is consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5. And this is despite the sort of grand fanfare we had at the climate negotiations in 2023 at COP in Dubai, where there was this huge, sort of grandiose commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. No sign of that happening yet. And the reason is quite simple. People are not coming to the party. The oil majors are simply not playing their role. So, for example, Saudi Aramco this year looked to ditch the $100 per barrel target just to secure market share. BP, another oil major, standing back from its renewables target. So a major problem. And we can see how large the problem is in terms of these oil majors, because attribution science, the ability to attribute impacts to particular sources and causes, is improving. And this year, a couple of really interesting papers came out. One which showed that Chevron, for example, is responsible for between 800 to about $3.5 trillion in climate damage. And another which showed that the emission of the carbon majors contributed to half of the increase in heatwave intensity since the pre-industrial period. So we can see how important these huge industries, fossil fuel industries, are. But it's not only all about oil, it's also about coal. Global coal demand rose by 1.5% in 2024 to reach near record levels of just under 9 billion tons, a new record, and we're likely to stay at those near record levels until 2027. We're seeing massive consumption happening in China and India, ironically, often because they need new power to drive air conditioning because the world is getting warmer. And so no surprise when we look at, what is powering countries around the world, the bulk of this power is still coming out of the fossil fuel sector, except for the European Union. But there's also sort of variable news coming out of the EU. Just this year, the EU utilities generate 13% more electricity from fossil fuels during the first half of the year compared to the same period last year. And this is due to low wind, because they're having wind droughts, because the temperature differential between the polar regions and the rest of the world is decreasing. And hydro output also fell because of reduced snow and rainfall because of climate change. So we can see there are challenges even for the front runners in weaning themselves off fossil fuels. So no big surprise when we got to Copernicus, which is the European Climate Service, releasing their annual highlights for last year. No one was surprised that 2024 has emerged as the warmest year on record. And really, very few people in climate change science were surprised that it was the first year to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the first calendar year to exceed that critical guardrail. It doesn't mean that we've exceeded the 1.5 as envisaged in the Paris Agreement, because that's an average over 20 years. It's not just an annual exceedance. But a paper appeared this year, which I think sort of very judiciously observed that a year above 1.5 probably signals that we're within that 20-year period as well. The last 10 years have been the 10 warmest years on record. And amongst those, 2023 and 2024 really stand out as super warm years. And you can see this if you look at temperature anomalies for those 2 years compared to all the years previously since 1940. And unfortunately, the news is 2025 is in that zone. If we look back at the last month, September came in at 1.47 relative to pre-industrial. But if we look at the 12-month average from October last year to September this year, that's coming in at 1.51. The UK Met Office thinks 2025 is going to be the second or third warmest year on record. And unfortunately, it's not just limited to the land. We're seeing unprecedented sea surface temperatures as well during those 2 years, 2023 and 2024. And again, 2025 is following suit in that regard, despite the fact that the El Nino event was not as strong as the previous El Nino events that we've previously experienced. And this is having consequences. Just over the last couple of weeks, the Global Tipping Point report for this year has come out, and that announced that we reached our first climate tipping point. So remember when I spoke about the at-risk ecosystems, I spoke about the corals. Well, the tipping point report indicates that we're now reaching that first tipping point with the widespread mortality of coral reefs. We've been in a major global bleaching event since January 2023. It's the strongest bleaching event of the 4 that we've had so far. And this global tipping point report indicates that unless global heating is reduced to 1.2 degrees as fast as possible, the warm water corals will not remain at any meaningful scale. And that's hugely problematic because the livelihoods of literally hundreds of millions of people are dependent on the coral reefs, which essentially are the Amazon forests of the oceans. Now, there is some scientific debate about, the fact that some corals might be able to survive these higher temperatures, but I think the fact that we are seeing these global scale coral bleaching events indicates the scale of the problem we're facing. If we look at what WMO imagines the rest of this decade will look like, they reckon that these sort of global mean temperatures are likely to continue at near record levels for the remainder of this decade, and there's a 70% chance that the 5-year average warming for that period will be greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is all important because it relates to the most important number in that synthesis report. We said by 2035, if you're interested in limiting global warming to 1.5, global emissions need to be 60% below 2019 levels. Now, that 2035 is a really critical date in the policy and practice space because it's the end date for this new batch of climate plans that the governments have been delivering during the course of this year before this year's climate negotiations in Belém in Brazil. Are we likely to be able to achieve that? As I said right at the beginning of this presentation, a group of Working Group 1 authors have been updating all the key indicators we used during the 6th assessment cycle. What they showed when they updated those indicators, that if we're interested in having a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5, the remaining carbon budget in the atmosphere comes in at 130 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Now, that's much smaller than what we had in the 6th assessment cycle at 500 gigatons. And bear in mind, we're producing about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually as a species. So that's a budget we're about to blow in 3 years. But 50% probability is quite low. So if we increase our chances up to 67%, that global carbon budget reduces to 80 gigatons of carbon dioxide. basically that'll be gone in less than 2 years. And as observed in a recent paper this year by some IPCC colleagues, Andy Reisinger and others, there simply is no historical precedent or scenario where emissions could be reduced sufficiently to keep global emissions within that sort of carbon budget. It's simply too small. And so, quite frankly, if we look at the extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and more dangerous, a very different world, it really depends on the kind of actions we take now. People like myself from the baby boomers, the Generation Jones, we're going to have a hot and sweaty retirement, no doubt about that. But for millennials, Gen Z, the Generation Alpha, there's a real existential threat in the mix if we continue with emissions at current levels. And that brings me to my reality check. This is where I put on my local government hat. It's great to talk about the science and what might theoretically be possible in the world of policy and practice, but this is the time now to get really pragmatic. We're seeing a fossil fuels resurgence. We're seeing an increase in far-right populism. We're seeing attacks on civil society and protest rights. AI is in the mix, accelerating disinformation and corporate power. We're seeing polarization and deep economic insecurity around the world. So we've got to be pragmatic. The likelihood of the safe landing space that we've spoken about consistently over the last couple of decades is now much lower than the probability of ending up with unprecedentedly high and probably very dangerous temperature increases. And we've got to bite the bullet and think about what that means. And so while we might admire the politicians who drag us from one set of climate negotiations to the next at the end of every year, talking about keeping 1.5 alive, in fact, we need to get realistic. The question is no longer whether global warming will exceed 1.5. It's by when and by how much and for how long we're going to exceed that critical guardrail. When might we cross this particular guardrail of 1.5? Well, Copernicus monitoring suggests maybe May 2029. A more recent paper that came out this year suggests maybe 2028. And if you look at the new methods being used to try and assess our current level of global warming, because remember the IPCC looks at an average over a decade. So the current IPCC indicator suggests somewhere between 1.22 and 1.25. That's actually reflecting back, because it's a 10-year average, to a temperature in about 2019. If we're more interested in understanding where we are today, a number of different methods are being used, and they suggest that we're somewhere between 1.34 and 1.41. But because of the level of uncertainty in the methods, and they're working to refine that currently, the possibility that we've already exceeded 1.5 cannot be ruled out. So we're in very dangerous territory, folks. And this is where we need to get radically realistic about what and where we're at. The simple message is we have failed as a society. Yes, climate action is happening, but we failed because that action hasn't been fast or transformative enough. We've certainly avoided the worst case scenarios. So we're not going to see global warming of 4 degrees, 6 degrees, which were previously on the table. But we've also got to be honest and acknowledge we've missed out on the best case scenarios. So the chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 or below 1.5 are virtually no longer possible. This raises the key question is, where is this temperature actually going to peak? How long are we going to stay there? And how quickly could we return to 1.5? Because remember, this concept of overshoot in terms of the IPCC is not only the exceedance of the temperature, but a return to that temperature. And it poses really difficult challenges for us, because instead of pursuing this goal from below, which we had before, we've now got to pursue it from above, which is more challenging. So what are we talking about? Well, the current state of science suggests that we should absolutely try not to exceed by more than 1.8 degrees Celsius. We should try and limit that and make it temporary and return to 1.5 as soon as possible, by the end of the century at the latest. But there's also emerging science which suggests that we may not be able to reverse those temperature increases, that strong Earth system feedbacks may continue to drive the warming, which poses a real challenge. And because of the political reticence in talking about the fact that we failed, there have been very limited efforts to date to understand the risks and impacts of overshoot pathways. And so what we've got to get realistic about is that the current story we face from a climate change perspective is of not a first best world, it's a second or third best world. And it raises very real ethical questions, because if we think about that trajectory of exceedance and then return, it's the poor and vulnerable. We're going to have to deal with the pain of the impacts of exceedance, so the increase in extreme events, etc. But they're also going to have to deal with the pain of our attempts to pull temperatures back down. So, for example, for Africa, we could see large-scale bioenergy carbon capture and storage projects, which impact on our water and food security. And we've got to acknowledge, too, that if we are capable of dragging the temperature back down again, it won't reverse all risks and impacts. Some of these impacts will be irreversible because we will have exceeded limits in adaptation. The lives lost, the species going extinct, that will be irreversible. We'll also potentially cross tipping points. You know, the fact that we're already talking about crossing the tipping points for coral suggests we're in that zone. So we need a much broader public and political debate around this expanded risk landscape. We can't pretend to be ostriches anymore and hide our heads in the sand. We probably need a new model of development to deal with this change. We certainly need a new toolbox that allows us to factor in overshoot to all the planning that we're doing at the local, regional, and national level to deal with these near-term realities and the long-term reversal impacts. But the one big message is, don't get into doom scrolling around this. We simply can't backslide. This is a call for much more ambitious action than we've ever seen before, because the goal doesn't change. Even with overshoot, we must keep doing as much as we can, as ambitiously as we can. So if we're looking at the pragmatic scenario, we're almost certainly going to exceed 1.5. 2 probably won't be achieved either, and that's the one that really worries me. 3 is more likely. The message is do more of everything. It's like that movie, you know, everything, everywhere, all at once. We've got to do more mitigation, more adaptation, more finance, more addressing loss and damage. We ultimately need a response that's developmental, fair, and equitable. We've got to start measuring success in terms of not only carbon, but in terms of human and ecosystem well-being. So the message I give all my practitioner colleagues is mitigate as if 1.5 was possible, adapt for 2, and try and think about how we build resilience for 3. I'm pleased to say that the first steps in the global conversation around this difficult topic have started to happen. We had the first Global Overshoot Conference at IASA in Austria this year, which has opened up the science around overshoot that's beginning to emerge. And I and others are working on preparing UNEP's Spotlight Report on Overshoot, which we will release in June of next year on World Environment Day, to stimulate this global conversation around this important issue. So that's it from me. I'm happy to try and answer any questions that this presentation may have provoked.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Debra. A really comprehensive sort of tour de force through these kinds of issues, and a really troubling kind of sense of this overshoot problem. So we do have a fair amount of time for for questions. Because we're doing this strictly online, we thought it would be easiest if we just deal with one question at a time, and Debra can answer each one. So if you'd like to ask a question, I think the technology should allow you to raise your hand, and then we can come to you so you can ask your question. So the floor is now open for kind of any questions. I'm going to need some help from the team to just point out to me if someone's hand's up. Can I rely on you for that, Rahul?
Yes, sure. I don't see any hands as yet. Oh, there's one from. I'll enable talking. It's from Julia.
All right, Julia, over to you.
Hi, Prof. Roberts. Thank you so much for a very sobering presentation. I must say I feel a little bit depressed. But I wanted to ask, what is your kind of feeling of hope or not around the upcoming COP in Brazil? I work at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits, and we've really struggled to figure out access issues, so it doesn't seem like we'll be able to go. Have you heard of similar issues, and what do you think this might mean for negotiations? Yeah, some thoughts on that. And then also if you could share kind of what you think about the current policy space in South Africa with the climate change bill half enacted but half not, and any thoughts on the carbon budget. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Julia. And I suppose I want to engage with your sense of being slightly depressed by my presentation. That's not the message I want to leave you with. In fact, I think what I want to leave you with is this challenge has increased by an order of magnitude. So we don't have time for depression, folks. Pack your depression away. This is the time for action, increased ambition, the need to do more, and unfortunately to get down in the trenches. Certainly on COP30 at Belém in Brazil, the last I heard is only 43 countries were registered because of the access difficulties. And to give you an example, I've got a colleague that I've known for many years. I negotiated with him. He comes from Timor-Leste. And he was telling me that the daily support provided for Global South attendance, I think, is like $136 a day, whereas, you know, if you want to be on one of the ships they're going to put in the Amazon, those rooms are coming in at $1,200 a day, and you've got to book for the full 2 weeks. So the logistics are clearly extremely challenging, and I think will hamper equal participation at the COP. And as a result, I am not optimistic that we will have you know, a fair baseline for negotiations there. I know certainly I was meant to go with a UNEP delegation, but even UNEP has stepped aside and will only be sending in Inga Anderson and her immediate support because of the costs. So even the UN institutions are challenged in terms of being present. I'm worried because one of the big things on the agenda for the COP is looking at the global goal on adaptation indicators that I and others have been working on, which is a really critical part of keeping the adaptation agenda on the radar of governments. But, you know, if you've got limited attendance, what becomes of those indicators? Will they get a fair chance at being reviewed and discussed by the broad majority? So no, I'm not optimistic currently about the outcomes. I mean, that may change dramatically over the next couple of weeks. I don't see how, but I think that's a challenge. Just in terms of the policy landscape in South Africa, you know, we're the 13th largest emitter in the world, but we also have these huge developmental challenges that we have to face. So we're one of the countries that are caught in the push and pull of the climate change debate. We've obviously got to accelerate our ambition, and as with, you know, the majority of countries around the world, the fact that we are in this position indicates that, you know, no one is yet doing enough, but the majority of countries in the global south, as I've indicated, are dependent on getting the support they need financially, technically, and in terms of capacity building. And even while I was a negotiator, that stuff never materialized. It still hasn't materialized. I mean, the discussions around the new quantified goal in Baku were a huge disappointment, because now we fully understand, you know, the kind of impacts the global south is going to be experiencing, and yet, you know, in terms of finance, that hasn't been forthcoming. So I think we're just not seeing sufficient ambition wherever you look around the globe. And a lot of that is linked to the availability of finance support. So I think that's a challenging space to be in as well.
Thanks for that. Let's move on to our next kind of question, and then we have two that have been typed. I'll come to that after we do the question from Tracy Lynn. So Tracy, over to you.
Thank you, Imraan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. So my question is about the IRP, which was announced this weekend, and honestly, I haven't had a chance to really look at what the headlines are saying: more nuclear and more gas, which sounds, you know, I feel quite dismayed when I hear that, because it seems like we are again preferring big energy requiring massive transmission investment as opposed to decentralized energy, which could rely on renewables. And also, I'm of the view that technically, legally, the RRP shouldn't even be able to include nuclear, but that's another story. My question, Deborah, is if you had a chance to write the IRP, and given what you've just said, what would it look like?
Well, I wouldn't write the IRP because I come from the adaptation community, not the mitigation community. So it'd be very dangerous to give me that particular pen. But I think what we are seeing is the need to move to renewable. And it just goes back to the point I've made previously. We still have this incredibly strong reliance on fossil fuels, and the fact that gas is in the mix. It's being sold as a transitional way to get us from the current sort of coal and oil-based economy into whatever lies in the future, be that a hydrogen-based economy or so on. But the problem is that they're all fossil fuels, and you can't confuse the physics with politics. Physics is not going to be compelled to change itself by the fact that we are calling gas a transitional fossil fuel. It's carbon. It will generate more heating, and so I think that's the particular problem. You can't pull the wool over physics' eyes. It will continue to do what it needs to do. So we need to see more support for renewable energies at a far greater scale. But yeah, the politics are changing. We certainly know, we've heard from politicians around the world, drill, baby, drill, mine, baby, mine, King coal is, a term we've heard from South African politicians. So you've got a huge combination of events happening at this point in time. For example, with the US pulling out of JP and support, political will, financial support, all of this is meaning that our process of tackling this challenge is not as ambitious as it needs to be. But as I say, mitigation is not my arena, so I certainly wouldn't be writing the IRP.
Great, thank you. I just want to move on to some of the typed questions now. I'll come back to the hands up in a short while. So, Deborah, there's a question from Nishama Brody, who's kind of at Wits, and her question is, what are the specific actions we should be looking at or lobbying for in South Africa? And how would this differ between regions? For example, the Gauteng versus KZN versus the Western Cape.
Yeah. So, I think in some way we've dealt with this in the prior questions. Obviously, the need to transition our economy into a greener economy, one that is more dependent on renewable energies, less so on our reliance on coal, even though we know that energy security and energy poverty are still a major issue. We should take that transition as an opportunity to address those developmental needs. So I think that's important from a mitigation point of view for the country as a whole. Where I do think there are regional differences is in our adaptation. I think these changes are impacting on our provinces in quite different ways. So for example, the drying of the Western Cape, we saw Cape Town potentially becoming the first city in history to reach day zero. We've seen the flooding in Durban. And in fact, I was just at a meeting last week where the UK Met Office was doing some projection around extremely hazardous cyclonic activity. And they were showing like these huge Category 5 cyclones hitting Durban and Mozambique in 2087. These things are things we should be thinking about, and I feel very personally about this because in all the floods we've had, my house is at the bottom of a slope. So every time it rains now and we have excessive rainfall, I've got like a river running through our lounge, and that's quite personally worrying to me as we look at greater intensity. So I think the levels of adaptation where we put development We should be planning strategic retreat in some areas. We need to be thinking about those things now. So I think at a nation level, definitely looking at the mitigation burden, moving the economy away from fossil fuels. I think at the regional level, it's looking at those different adaptation needs, because cities are hard to turn around in days and weeks. You know, if we're going to plan strategic retreat of key infrastructure, that's stuff we need to be planning now.
Right. Deborah, staying with the typed Q&A, there's a question from Zach Issa that I think a few others have touched on too. So the question is, I'm curious, in your view, how does the return to growth as the ultimate objective of our our economies can affect the choices available for climate action? Is green growth possible, or is it desirable? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think there are a number of schools of thought on this, things like degrowth and so on. The fact of the matter is, again, I'm a realist and I'm a pragmatist, is we're already seeing that we're reaching limits in terms of the planetary system. And I think it's been said over a number of decades, you can't pursue infinite growth on a finite planet. The math simply doesn't add up. So we do need to be rethinking development and moving away from our obsession with GDP as the metric of success, to looking at well-being as the ultimate outcome. But that's very challenging, because what it does is it challenges the development model that we currently have. And the problem with the current development model is a number of very powerful people and countries are benefiting from it. And so there's no easy transition in that sense. So I think we've got to be rethinking our development path substantially. We've got to acknowledge that we're hitting limits. And it's not only in climate change that we're hitting limits. We've seen the massive biodiversity loss. We've seen the kind of limits we're now reaching because of levels of pollution through things like microplastics and the forever chemicals. But it does require us to ask new questions and change the way we live our lives. But we're remarkably resistant to change, particularly when it impacts on us personally. So I'll give you a good example of that just to illustrate. I was doing outreach in the US, and I won't name the college, but I was on one of the stops at a small liberal arts college in the US for a week. And at the beginning of the week, all the undergraduate students were so excited. You know, we had lunch together. They were all deeply committed to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But by the time we got to Wednesday lunch, I said, you do realize what this means is that people in Africa are currently dying because of climate change, which means you need to change your lifestyles. You know, you need to drop the aspirations of 2.5 cars per family, you know, like 3 televisions, et cetera, et cetera. And that's immediately when the mood changed, because even with the younger generation being as committed as they were, they began to say, oh, no, we don't like that. That takes away options. We're not certain we want to engage with that kind of conversation. So it's great to talk about changing the economy, but are we prepared to give up and change the way we live our lives? And ultimately, we haven't proved that to date. So I think these changes are going to be quite difficult for us.
Right, Deborah, thank you. Let me go back to the hands then, and kind of over to Mary Bigley, so she can ask her question.
Thank you very much indeed. Fantastic presentation, and yeah, I mean, very sobering as well. Gosh, it would make you feel very depressed, not just about the climate, but also about human beings. We're horrible, aren't we? We're just horrible, and so selfish. But I mean, I have a million questions. One of them I wanted to ask you is, and I don't know if the IPCC largely concentrates on public policy, government policy, or also looks at initiatives from private enterprise. But my question is a simple enough one. There's an awful lot of companies and industries that work hard trying to greenwash what they do and introduce kind of assuaging measures that allow us all to continue to gobble vociferously while kind of offsetting the effects of what we're doing. Two examples, I mean, one is the whole plastics industry, ever more complex and extraordinary ways of using and reusing and recycling and stretching out plastic, when we maybe should stop making so much of it altogether. And the other one then, kind of the whole flying industry, and all this carbon offsetting stuff that you can buy, which will allow you to fly 28 more times this year than you might have flown last year. So are there measures that are, absolute hogwash that could be called out in a very sort of specific way by the IPCC and that would make its way into the mainstream, so that those of us carry it on? Are some of those measures actually resulting in even worse effects for our climate and even greater carbon emissions? And therefore, having them there at all is more damaging than in any way useful.
Thanks, Mary. Let me deal with that first statement about us being just simply a horrible species. Last week, as part of the meeting that I was involved in, we went to the Sterkfontein caves and had the opportunity to both walk and crawl, which was very interesting if you got claustrophobia through them. And it was just a reminder to me what an extraordinary hominid lineage we are part of. So while I think we may be a species which has, unfortunately, now experiencing the repercussions of our short-termism, we're also a species that's shown remarkable durability and adaptability to survive as long as we have. And we've never been richer. We've never had more knowledge than we are. So while we might be, at this point beset by our short-termism, we're also a species with enormous potential if we put our big brains and wills behind it. So I think that's important, because we should be thinking not only about our species, but every other species we share this planet with. So I haven't quite given up on us yet, but I will hold our feet to the fire over the fact that we tend to be deluding ourselves. For example, not wanting to speak about overshoot and the fact that we have failed on one of our key aspirations. And that relates to your broader point. Of course, there's a lot of greenwash out there, and you can see that in the literature. What was very revealing to me when Durban hosted the COP17, way back in 2011, one of the things we wanted to do, for example, was make the COP in Durban carbon neutral. So we put out, a request for proposals on this, and we got all sorts of interesting submissions from around the world of, the offsetting proposals. And it didn't take long for us to scratch beyond the veneer of these proposals. We couldn't find a decent proposal in them that didn't have some fatal flaw. And so ultimately we ended up producing our own response in that regard. So it's definitely out there. There's no doubt. And I think there is literature calling out the various, offsetting mechanisms and some of the greenwash that lies behind some of those. The role of the IPCC, though, is it doesn't deal with that. So the IPCC is not prescriptive. So you will always hear the mantra from those of us who write the reports: we are policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. So we will assess what is in the literature. And if this material is in the literature, we will call it out, but we will not give guidance on that. So we will look across the scientific literature and pull elements together. But I think the strong message is that's emerged from the most recent IPCC report, and I suspect we will reinforce in the upcoming cities report, which we'll release in 2027, is just simply we haven't done enough, and what we've done is not sufficient. And in some cases, it has led to negative feedbacks. So you've had offsetting projects that I've heard about where there's been large-scale deforestation in places that have affected land tenure. Indigenous communities have been thrown off the land, or the afforestation has been done in grasslands in places that trees should never have been. And I think there's a growing literature around that. But the IPCC will call that out if it's in the literature, but it won't prescribe what needs to be done about that. It leaves that to the governments.
Debra, since this is a kind of a Since this is a seminar at Wits University, I wanted to go to the question that Steve Nichols has shared with us. The question is, what is the role of the academic community to help drive ambition, at least in South Africa? There's so much misinformation in the climate and energy debates, and it really needs strong voices. So you not only work in the policy space and the IPCC space, but also in the academic community. So any thoughts on Steve's question?
Well, the first thing I would say is Steve is actually the person who should write the IRP. So he's the mitigation guru. So I nominate Steve to write the new IRP for us. Then we might get closer to meeting goals. I think the academic community is, for me, has a very interesting role to play. And the reason that I've gone back to academia, having left it in a huff in my early career, because I didn't feel it was doing enough that related to the real world, is that I think it has the ability to ask some of these really difficult questions that politically are difficult to get to in our current scenarios. So, just having been at the Overshoot conference at IASA at the end of September, the beginning of October, just to see the powerful science that's being done out of the academic community, which is allowing us to probe this issue of overshoot, where the politicians won't touch it with a barge pole. And so for me, that's the real role of academia at this point in time, is to try and keep us honest, to keep us focused on what we need to achieve and where we are not succeeding, and indicate the consequences of that. So for me, academia is the place to ask the really big and tricky questions, because this is the century where we've got to deal with what they're now referring to, unfortunately, using jargon, the polycrisis. It's a case of we're having to deal with climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, increasing poverty in some parts of the world, increasing inequality. And the question is, what does that add up to? And I think you need a voice, a strong voice, who's prepared to shine a spotlight onto those really difficult questions, to keep pushing the boundaries, not only of creating a more realistic understanding of where we are, but what the potential is. So for example, in my presentation, I indicated we needed new tools. We need to think about development in a new way, but what does that actually look like? And that was my frustration as a local government official who served several mayors. I knew we needed to develop the city in a different way, but what does it actually mean for Africa? I mean, what does an African city under overshoot conditions actually look like? What kind of services, where, when, for whom? And these are questions that, quite frankly, the world of policy and practice can't get to, because we're just so busy trying to deal with the challenges that we're facing. And so for me, academia is the place where you really can ask these big questions and think about things outside of the box in a way that potentially practice and policy doesn't have the space for at this point in time.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to think we're trying to meet that high bar you've set, Edward. So thanks for that. Perhaps the last question, to move from one part of the education sector to the other. There's a question from Shaylin Naidu, asking what your thoughts are on the themes around climate change that might be incorporated into the South African school curriculum.
Yeah, the problem is, and thank you for that question, Shaylin, is I come from a generation, number one, we were taught nothing about climate change. And when we did bump into it, it's a constant narrative around carbon and carbon dioxide. Now, I ask you in all honesty how many times in a day do you think about an invisible gas that you can not smell? And I mean, it really doesn't have any meaningful impact on your life. And I think that's been a problem with the way we've kind of educated people in the environmental sciences. We've given them an understanding of the physical climate, but we've not given them an equivalent understanding of how that relates to our socioeconomic lives, which is really what's of priority to us. Even I don't get up every morning and think about carbon dioxide as the first thing. You know, I think about the socioeconomic condition that I'm facing. And I think the way we need to change the curriculum is certainly talk about carbon dioxide, but the consequences for people's lives, for development options and choices. You know, what development choices, you know, for someone who was born yesterday, their development options are very different to the kind of choices I had when I was born, just simply because we removed options off the table with the way we've developed our society. And I think really putting that human face onto some of these issues is really important, because I think that's what will encourage action and behavioral change. If you can actually self-identify with the problem, not talk abstractly and theoretically around things. So I think, you know, we learn about things from the soles of our feet up. You know, I love biodiversity and that, not because, you know, and certainly I love biology at school, but I love it because as a child, I had unstructured play in Africa's savannas. I ran literally barefoot between the thorn trees. And it's that I learned my passion for biodiversity by running in nature. I now have a personal identification with that. And that's, I think science and society have sort of drifted off in different ways. And I saw Colleen Fokker was on the call. You know, the work that Colleen has done, for example, in trying to bridge between the physical climate science and people and people doing things in day-to-day lives. And that's what I think we could bring to the curriculum, is showing the younger generation that this actually means something to you, and it'll mean something to you in your career options, the number of years you have in education, your ability to earn, et cetera, et cetera. These have real consequences in your lives. And I think that's what we need to be doing, is making this stuff more meaningful to people's lives.
Right. I think we can with that kind of bring the seminar to a close. Let me just thank you on behalf of everyone, Debra, for a really, really fantastic afternoon. I think you've taken us through kind of all of the global issues, the data, the challenges, kind of the policy questions, kind of, and also notwithstanding much of the bad news, actually provided us with some hope to kind of humanity actually trying to solve this problem and doing it now in a kind of in a really kind of successful way. So I think we all really grateful for the talk, for the fact that you made the time to be with us today, and for kind of sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for kind of joining us for the seminar this afternoon. We have plans for a pretty exciting program for 2026, so we'll share that as soon as it's out, and kind of we look forward to hosting you for many more of these events at kind of at Wits University. So with that, let's then bring the afternoon to a close. Kind of have a good afternoon, everyone.
And remember, no depression, no doom scrolling, do more.
Thank you so much, Debra.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye.